Don't act innocent, Maria. I know you stole it. The accusation came out like a thunderclap, like a verdict, straight to her heart. Where's the bracelet? The diamond heirloom my grandmother gave me, and you? You're the only one who was in my room today. Don't play dumb. Kelly, the mistress of the house where Maria worked, relentlessly accused her of stealing, and no weak apologies could touch any. Have you ever wondered why a person, with nothing but their hands to offer, can become the very thing that holds everything together, yet is the first one to be discarded when everything falls apart? Maria Wilson had been working at the Morgan estate for 5 years. Years spent scrubbing, dusting, making coffee, polishing floors, and cooking meals, all while moving silently through the vast halls, trying her best to become invisible. In a house like this, that was the only way to survive. Maria had been raised to believe in silence. It was an unspoken rule, taught by her mother, ingrained in her like the dirt on her shoes. Stay quiet and you'll stay safe. But nothing in her life had ever been safe. She just hadn't realized it yet. The Morgan family lived in a house that could swallow you whole. The mansion wasn't just grand, it was a statement, and they, the family, were the picture of success in this world. Chad Morgan, the father, had built an empire. Sally Morgan, the mother, had perfected the art of being the perfect wife, perfect hostess. And then there was Kelly, the daughter, whose every need was served with perfection, wrapped in a bow of privilege and entitlement. But Maria, she was something else entirely. She was the help, the maid. She was the woman who made sure everything was neat, clean, and in order. A woman with no name, no seat at the table, no place at the party. Her life, like her hands, was meant to be used but never seen. Until one day, those hands were accused of something they didn't do. It was a Tuesday morning, and the house was humming with its usual quiet rhythm. The floors gleamed, the kitchen was spotless, the guest room was perfect. Maria had spent the morning polishing the windows in the living room, humming softly to herself. She had learned to find comfort in the silence of her work, the hum of the vacuum, the sweep of the broom, the clink of dishes in the sink. It was the only time she could think, find peace with herself, and forget the walls that surrounded her. But that morning everything changed. Kelly Morgan stormed into the living room, her face twisted in a way Maria had never seen before. And the words she spoke hit Maria like a slap. "I know you took it," Kelly said, her voice sharp and accusing. "You're the only one in my room today. You were cleaning and you took it." Maria stood frozen, the dusting cloth slipping from her fingers. She hadn't even processed what Kelly had said, her mind still foggy from the sudden accusation. I didn't take anything," Maria stammered, her voice trembling, though she wasn't sure whether it was from fear or confusion. But Kelly wasn't listening. "You're lying," she yelled, her eyes wild with rage. "You're nothing but a thief. I can't believe I trusted you. And now my grandmother's bracelet is gone." Maria felt a lump form in her throat, the words catching on the way out. Her heart pounded in her chest, and cold sweat began to bead on the back of her neck. She had cleaned Kelly's room that morning, yes, but she hadn't done anything else. She hadn't touched the dresser, she hadn't even looked at the bracelet. And yet here she stood, accused of theft. "I didn't steal anything," Maria said, her voice louder now, stronger. She tried to take a step back, but Kelly was already stepping toward her, her finger pointing accusingly at Maria's chest. "Don't act innocent with me," Kelly snarled. "You think you can just come in here, take what you want, and nobody will know? You're not part of this family. You're just a maid." Maria's breath caught in her throat, and she took another step back, the weight of Kelly's words pressing down on her. She was nothing, just a shadow in this house. She had always known it, but it had never been as clear as it was in that moment. "I didn't take anything," Maria repeated. Her voice steady now, but tears started to burn in the back of her eyes. Kelly didn't listen. She shoved Maria, pushing her hard enough that Maria stumbled backwards, her feet skidding on the polished wood floor. The bottle of polish in her hand clattered to the ground, spilling its contents across the floor. Maria's back hit the wall hard, her shoulder aching from the impact. "You need to leave," Kelly shouted, her voice rising in a shrill scream, "before I call the cops on you." Maria stood there, looking at the woman who had once been kind to her. The one who had asked her to clean her room, cook her breakfast, and now was accusing her of theft. "I didn't take anything," Maria whispered again. Her voice barely audible, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. And soon Sally Morgan, the matriarch of the house, appeared. Her face a mask of confusion. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes shifting between Maria and Kelly. "She stole my bracelet," Kelly cried, tears of rage filling her eyes. "It was my grandmother's. I left it on my dresser this morning, and now it's gone." Maria opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't explain. No one was listening. And then, like a familiar melody, Chad Morgan appeared, his face cold and unreadable. His eyes locked onto Maria, and he didn't even ask for an explanation. Instead, he simply asked, "Did you take it?" Maria felt her chest tighten, and for the first time in her life she was truly afraid. It didn't matter what she said, it wouldn't make a difference. They had already decided. She was guilty, and no amount of pleading would change that. "No, sir," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would never." Maria's words hung in the air, fragile and unsupported. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with doubt and accusation. Chad Morgan stood there, unmoving, his gaze cold and calculating. Maria could feel the weight of his eyes, drilling into her, searching for a crack in her story, for a sign of guilt. But all he saw was a woman who had spent 5 years cleaning this house, who had worked hard, without complaint, without question. But that was the thing, wasn't it? In a house like this, there were only 2 kinds of people, those who belonged and those who didn't. And Maria didn't belong. Behind her, Sally Morgan stepped forward, her elegant robe flowing like a river of silk as she crossed the room. "Kelly, are you sure?" she asked, her voice softer than her daughter's, but with an edge of concern that couldn't disguise her disbelief. "Could you have misplaced it? Or maybe—" "No," Kelly interrupted, her voice sharp and final. "I'm not crazy, Mom. I saw it there. I always leave it on the left side of the dresser, right next to my perfume. And now it's gone. Maria was the only one in my room today. She must have taken it." Maria's heart twisted in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. How many times had she cleaned that room, tidied that dresser, made sure everything was in place, without ever thinking to take anything? But now it didn't matter. Kelly had already decided. The words were already out there, echoing in the hallway, and the stain of suspicion was already on her. "I didn't take anything," Maria said, but the words felt hollow, like they were slipping through her fingers before they even left her mouth. The tension in the room was unbearable. Lisa, the cook, and Harold, the groundskeeper, had arrived in the hallway, drawn by the noise. They stood back, watching, but Maria could feel their eyes on her. They were waiting too, waiting to see how this would unfold, but they wouldn't speak. Not yet. Not until they knew how the winds were blowing. Chad Morgan crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. "We'll check the cameras," he said, his voice flat. "I'm sure the footage will tell us what happened." Maria's stomach dropped. The cameras, the security cameras that watched every corner of this estate. She had never thought about them much, but now they were her enemy. "We don't need to check anything," Kelly snapped, stepping closer to her father. "I already know what happened." Maria took it. "She's always in my room, always looking around like she owns the place. She's nothing but a maid, a thief, and that's all she'll ever be." Maria flinched at the words. Thief. Weir. She couldn't stop them from echoing in her mind. Thief, thief. Her eyes burned, but she fought back the tears. She had worked so hard. She had given everything to this job, had given everything to this family. And this is how they repaid her? With accusations, with suspicion, with the cold, sharp sting of rejection? "I'm not leaving," Maria said quietly, her voice trembling, but determined. "I didn't steal anything. You have my word." But it was too late. The damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing quickly, fed by Kelly's anger, watered by her father's indifference. Sally, always the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over, was now standing silently in the corner, looking between her daughter and the maid she had once trusted. "I think it's best if you stay here," Chad said, his voice low and cold, "until we figure this out." He motioned to the hallway, the stairs, the living room. "We don't need any more trouble. You'll stay in the guest room until we get to the bottom of this." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but there was no point. What was the use in fighting when they had already made up their minds? When they had already decided what she was? A thief, a maid, invisible, like she always was and always would be. "I'll stay," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She folded her arms across her chest, feeling a chill settle in her bones. She wasn't guilty, but it didn't matter. Not here. Not in this house. They had already decided she was. Kelly turned to walk away, her back stiff with anger. Sally followed, her footsteps hesitant, like she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. And Maria? Maria stood there motionless, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Maria moved slowly toward the hallway, where Lisa stood watching her with a sad, resigned look in her eyes. The silence between them was thick like a wall. No, and Maria couldn't bring herself to speak. Not now. Not when the whole world seemed to have turned against her. Lisa's voice was soft as she stepped closer. "You didn't do it, Maria," she said, her eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. "I know you didn't." But even as Lisa said the words, Maria could hear the uncertainty in them. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She had seen it in their eyes, in the way they looked at her now. The doubt was there, the suspicion was there, and no amount of words could erase it. Maria slowly walked back to the stairs, her feet heavy with the burden of what had just happened. She wanted to scream, to shout that she was innocent, to plead with them to see the truth. But it didn't matter, not here, not in this house. She turned to look out the window, her hand resting lightly on the rail, her mind whirling. How had it come to this? How had everything she had worked for, everything she had built with her own hands, been reduced to this? She didn't know, but she did know one thing, Serioth, the truth wasn't going to be enough. Not when the whole world had already decided who she was. Not when the cameras were rolling and the accusation had already been made. The house around Maria seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The light that had once poured through the grand windows now felt distant, almost foreign. She stood in the guest room, the door slightly ajar, listening to the soft hum of the house, the murmurs of voices below, the rustling of footsteps. She could hear the conversation in the kitchen, the low voices of Sally and Chad, but she couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. She knew what they were saying. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The weight of it all pressed down on her like a stone. The accusations, the silence, the way the Morgans had treated her, it all felt like a lifetime ago. She had worked for them, she had served them. And now she was nothing more than a suspect in a crime she didn't commit. The house felt different now. It wasn't the same place she had come to know, the house where she had spent countless hours cleaning, cooking, listening to the Morgans talk about their lives, their plans, their dreams. Now it was a place of distrust, a place where her presence was unwelcome, a place where the truth didn't matter. Maria couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. She had spent years here, years of hard work, and yet it wasn't enough. The stain of suspicion was already there, a mark that would never wash off. No matter how many times she scrubbed, no matter how much she cleaned. She thought of Malik, her younger brother back home. He had always looked up to her, always believed in her, even when the world hadn't. She couldn't let him down, she couldn't let the Morgans win, but what was the point? They had already made up their minds. Maria was a thief. Maria was guilty. No amount of words, no amount of pleading would change that. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway again, and Maria looked up, her heart racing. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, then the sound of a door creaking open. It was Chad? Maria? He called, his voice low, almost hesitant. Can we talk? She stood up slowly, her feet heavy against the floor. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing, Myrtle, there was no going back from this. There was no undoing what had been done. No words could erase the feeling of betrayal that had settled in her chest like a stone. She opened the door, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. Chad Morgan stood in the hallway, his face unreadable. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a commanding presence. But today he looked different. There was a weariness in his eyes, a deep, tired sadness that seemed to weigh him down. Maria, he said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic, we need to talk. I need to know. Did you take it? Maria felt a rush of emotion, her chest tightening, her hands shaking. No, sir. I didn't take anything, she said, her voice shaking, but her words clear. I swear. Chad nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her, studying her. He looked like he was trying to find something in her eyes. Some sign of guilt, some crack in her story. But there was nothing. Maria had nothing to hide. She was telling the truth, but it didn't matter. They didn't want to believe her. We found the footage, Chad said after a long silence. We saw you go into the room, but there's nothing there. No evidence of you taking the bracelet. It's strange, Maria nodded, swallowing hard. It's strange because I didn't take anything. I was just cleaning. Chad stood there, his hands on his hips, as if trying to figure out what to say next. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Maria felt like she was drowning in it. She wanted to scream, to plead her case, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stood there, her body rigid, her heart heavy with the weight of the accusation. Finally, Chad sighed, his shoulders slumping. I don't know what to believe anymore. Kelly insists you took it, but there's no proof, Sally's. Not sure. But the fact remains, we have to find out what happened. Maria shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You don't need to find out. You already know. You've already decided what I am. A thief. Chad's eyes widened, and he took a step back. Maria, that's not what I meant. Then what do you mean? She interrupted, her voice rising. What do you want from me? You've already searched my room, you've already called me a criminal. What more is there to say? Chad opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The tension in the hallway was palpable. He looked like he was about to say something, but Maria didn't wait. She turned and walked back to her room, the heavy weight of his gaze following her every step. Maria slammed the door behind her and sank onto the bed. She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, her limbs heavy with the weight of everything she had just endured. The truth was so close, but it felt miles away. It didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter how many times she swore she hadn't taken anything. They had already made up their minds. The door creaked open again, and Maria's heart skipped a beat. She turned to find Sally standing in the doorway, her eyes soft with concern. "Maria," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know this is hard, but we're just trying to figure this out. Please, stay calm. Just stay calm." Maria swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I've been calm. For years. I've cleaned your house. I've cooked your meals. I've done everything you asked of me. And this is how you repay me? With suspicion? With shame?" Sally's face faltered, her eyes darting away, as if she didn't know how to respond. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment Maria wondered if Sally even saw her, really saw her, or if she was just another piece of furniture in the house, something to be cleaned and forgotten. "I didn't do it," Maria said again, her voice steadier now. "I didn't take anything." Sally nodded slowly, her face filled with uncertainty. "I believe you, Maria. But we have to do what we have to do." Maria's chest tightened as the door closed softly behind Sally. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the floor, before slowly sinking onto the bed. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the room seemed louder than ever before. Maria sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the sprawling garden outside. The bright, warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft, dappled shadows across the grass. But it felt wrong. The world outside the window, with its flowers and birds, had no connection to the world inside this house, where the air felt heavy with suspicion and betrayal. She could still hear the soft voices of Chad and Sally downstairs, their words indistinguishable, Gert. But the tension was clear. They were talking about her. She could feel it. They were discussing what to do next, deciding whether to call the police, whether to continue with the search, whether to continue pretending that they didn't already know everything they needed to know about her. The weight of their gaze on her, their judgment, had begun to feel suffocating, as if she had become a ghost in her own life, condemned to a room of glass walls, unable to escape the echo of their accusations. Maria had never felt more invisible than she did in that moment. The woman who had cleaned, who had cooked, who had listened to the petty grievances of the Morgans, was now a suspect in a crime she hadn't committed. She was a shadow, a mere figure in a house that had long stopped seeing her as a person. But she couldn't stay like this forever. She couldn't keep waiting for the truth to be acknowledged. Maria was not a prisoner of this house, though they wanted her to feel like one. She would not let herself be diminished by their lies. Maria stood up slowly, her body stiff, her mind racing. She crossed the room and walked to the window, her fingers lightly touching the glass. Her eyes moved across the sprawling estate, the manicured lawn that stretched out in all directions. This house, this perfect, shining house, had been her world for 5 years, but it had never been hers. Not really, it was theirs. The Morgans owned everything. They owned the house. They owned the land. They owned the very air Maria breathed. Her mind drifted back to the conversations she had overheard in the halls, the quiet whispers of how they'd talk about her when she wasn't around. She had always been the help, the invisible one, the woman who lived in the background. When they spoke of her, it was never with warmth. She was never part of their world. She was only the woman who cleaned it. But now she was something else entirely. Now she was a suspect, a threat, an intruder in their perfect life. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, her fingers curling around the cold metal. But before she could open it, there was a soft knock. The sound was hesitant, almost unsure. Maria's heart skipped. She knew who it was without having to look. Lisa. Maria opened the door. And there she was, the cook who had been working for the Morgans almost as long as Maria had. Her eyes were tired, the lines around her mouth deepening as she looked at Maria, her expression unreadable. "I brought you something," Lisa said, holding out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, turkey and coleslaw. "Thought you might be hungry." Maria stared at it for a moment, her mind too heavy to process anything as simple as food. She shook her head slowly, her chest tight with a sorrow that she couldn't name. "I'm not hungry, Lisa." Lisa didn't move. She just stood there, her hand still extended, offering the sandwich like it was the only thing she could offer to make this whole mess better. Maria saw the hesitation in her eyes, the quiet struggle that passed through her like a shadow. Lisa wasn't saying anything, but the silence spoke volumes. She knew. She knew Maria hadn't taken the bracelet, but she also knew that in a house like this, knowing the truth meant nothing. "You don't have to believe me," Maria said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "None of you do." "It doesn't matter," Lisa sighed and set the sandwich down on the desk next to the bed. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Maria, I believe you. I do. But you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting against the whole system. You're fighting against everything that's been built here, everything that's been built on lies." Maria stared at her, her heart aching with the truth in those words. Lisa was right. Maria wasn't just fighting for her innocence. She was fighting for something much bigger, something that went far beyond this house. She was fighting against a system that had already decided who she was, who had already decided that she didn't matter. "I never wanted to be part of that system," Maria whispered, her voice shaking. "But here I am, caught in it anyway." Lisa didn't reply. She just stood there, her eyes filled with a sorrow that Maria couldn't bear to look at. It was the same sorrow she had seen in the eyes of the Morgans, the same sorrow she had seen in the eyes of people who didn't want to see her at all. She was nothing to them. She had always been nothing to them. And now they were treating her as if she were a criminal. Lisa hesitated for a moment longer, then turned to leave, her footsteps fading down the hall. Maria closed the door behind her, the sound of the latch clicking shut like the closing of a chapter in her life. She felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the weight of everything too much to bear. But as she stood there, staring at the door, something shifted inside her, a spark of defiance, a flicker of something that refused to be crushed by the weight of their accusations, their silence, their cruelty. She wasn't going to let them define her. She wasn't going to let them take away her voice, her worth, her dignity. She was going to fight. Maria's breath was shallow, but there was a flicker of something fierce in her chest, something that refused to be swallowed by the hollow, tightening pressure of her emotions. She had been quiet for too long. She had stayed silent, invisible, patient. But now the world around her had shifted. Now she had a choice. The door to the guest room was closed, the silence outside suffocating in its own way. Yet within her, a pulse was beginning to quicken, a sense of urgency that told her this wasn't the moment to cower, to wait for someone to come and fix this. The truth was in her hands now, and she needed to hold on to it. She walked toward the window again, gazing out at the garden. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the perfectly trimmed grass. It was a beautiful scene, serene almost, but the beauty of it felt so far away. There was a disconnect, a gulf between the world outside and the world she found herself in now. She could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere outside, the hum of a life that continued, a life that had nothing to do with her. Inside, everything had stopped. She thought about the accusation, the words Kelly had thrown at her so easily. Thief. The label was like an anchor around her neck, weighing her down with each step. Maria's stomach turned as she thought about what had happened just hours ago, how quickly everything had unraveled, how her identity had been reduced to something smaller than the very dust she wiped from the floors. She had always been the help, but the help didn't have a voice. She had been taught all her life that it was her job to be unseen, unnoticed, that if she did everything right, worked hard enough, kept her head down, she might get a pat on the back, maybe even a thank you, but those things never came. In the Morgans' house, there was no room for appreciation, no room for someone like her, and yet she had been there every day, every morning for 5 years. She had served them, and they had never once questioned her loyalty. But now, suddenly, she was a thief, a criminal, a liar. Everything she had done, everything she had worked for was being twisted, turned into something unrecognizable. Her phone buzzed again, its sharp electronic ring cutting through the heavy silence. Maria hesitated, then picked it up from the desk where it sat, glowing softly in the dim light. It was a message from Malik, sis. I'm worried. I've been hearing things. The whole world is talking about what happened. Are you okay? The words hit her like a punch in the gut. Malik, her brother. The one person who had always believed in her. The one person who saw her, really saw her, not for her job, not for her title, but for who she was. I'm fine, Maria typed back quickly, wiping away the stray tear that had fallen down her cheek. Just tired, that's all. I'll be okay, don't worry about me. But inside she was anything but okay. The truth was eating her alive. She wasn't just battling the Morgans now. She was battling the lies that had been built around her, the stories that people had told themselves about her. She was fighting against a system that had defined her long before she ever had the chance to define herself. The door creaked open again, and this time it was Chad. He stepped inside the room, his face drawn, as if he had been carrying a weight of his own. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Maria, his eyes searching her face, trying to understand something that wasn't clear to him. I've seen the footage, he said, his voice low and hesitant. Maria nodded, her stomach clenching. She knew what footage he was referring to, the security cameras, the recordings that would expose the truth of her actions that day. The truth of what had actually happened in Kelly's room and, Maria asked, her voice shaky, but determined. Chad sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. There's nothing there, Maria. You were in her room, yes. But you didn't take anything. I've watched it. I don't know what happened to the bracelet, but it wasn't you. Maria's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she stood frozen, unable to move. The words felt like they had been ripped from her own mouth and thrown back at her. For so long she had been drowning in their suspicion, in their judgment. And now there was a shred of truth, a spark of validation. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Maria had already been branded a criminal in their eyes. No camera, no footage, no evidence would ever be enough to undo the damage that had been done. Chad hesitated, looking at Maria as if he was unsure of what to say next. I don't know what to say, Maria. I don't know how we got here. Maria swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the tears welling up again, the frustration, the anger, all of it rising to the surface. She wanted to scream, to tear the walls down, to make them see her, to make them believe her. "I didn't do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Chad replied softly, his voice filled with a sadness that Maria could barely recognize. "I believe you. But it's not just about the bracelet anymore, Maria. It's about everything. Everything we've been ignoring for so long." Maria shook her head. "I didn't take it," she said again, louder this time, "but it doesn't matter. You've already made your decision. You don't see me, not really. You never have." Chad looked away, his face reddening. "That's not true." But Maria wasn't listening. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had been invisible for so long, but now she could feel the weight of her own truth. And she wasn't going to let it be erased. Maria stepped toward the door, her voice low but strong. "I'm leaving, Chad. I'm not going to stand here, waiting for you to figure out what's going on. I don't belong here anymore. I never did." Chad moved to stop her, but Maria was already walking away, her footsteps steady and resolute. She didn't need to wait for their apology. She didn't need to wait for their validation. She had her own truth now, and that was enough. Maria walked through the empty hallways, her footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow silence of the house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very floor beneath her was reluctant to let her go. She had served this house, had spent years in its service, but now it felt like a prison. The walls closed in around her, every shadow a reminder of the judgment, the accusations, and the lies that had been planted deep within her. She could almost feel the weight of the house pressing down on her shoulders. But with each step, that weight grew lighter. The door to the outside world stood just ahead. It was the only thing left between her and freedom. It was the door that would take her away from everything she had known, away from the Morgans, away from the lies, and away from the shame they had forced upon her. But as she reached for the door, she paused. For a fleeting moment, Maria felt the tug of something in her chest. A pull to stay, to turn around, to fight for her place in this house that had never truly seen her, to fight for the respect she had never been given. But that was the thing, wasn't it? Respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, and the Morgans had already made their decision about her. No amount of pleading or fighting would change that. Maria shook her head, the thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. She couldn't stay here, not in a place where the truth had no voice, not in a place that had already erased her. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The world beyond the gates of the Morgan estate felt different. There was a weight to it, a weight that she hadn't felt before. It was as if she was stepping into a new life, a life that didn't carry the chains of their judgment. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the streets of Atlanta. Maria could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, but it wasn't gone completely. She had been accused, she had been judged, and now she was walking away. But there was something else now, something she hadn't expected to find: strength. She didn't need them to believe her. She didn't need their apology. Maria had her own voice now. She didn't need to be anyone's maid, anyone's servant. She didn't need to shrink herself to fit into their world. Maria walked down the sidewalk, her steps sure and steady, each one carrying her farther from the house that had tried to define her. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't matter. She was free. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her pocket, glancing down at the screen. Malik's name flashed across it, and for a moment a lump rose in her throat. "Sis, I'm proud of you. Don't let them take your peace. You're stronger than you think," Maria smiled faintly. The words felt like a balm to the deep wound in her heart. Malik had always believed in her. Always. Even when the world had turned its back on her, he had seen her. "I'm okay," she typed back. "I'll be home soon." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking. It wasn't the kind of peace she had imagined. It wasn't the quiet contentment of a life without struggle. No, this was something harder, something more resilient. Maria had fought for this peace, had fought for her right to be seen, to be heard, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Her feet carried her through the streets of Atlanta, each step carrying her closer to her future, a future she would shape on her own terms. The weight of the Morgans' accusations was still with her, but it wasn't as heavy now. She had walked out of their house, out of their lives, and she would never return to a life where she was treated like a shadow again. Taran-free. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know where she would go next or what she would do. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to shrink anymore. She wasn't going to hide. The evening air was cool against her skin as she walked toward the bus stop, her duffel bag still slung over her shoulder. A few people passed by, their faces unfamiliar, their lives a blur. But Maria didn't mind. She didn't need anyone to see her now. She had already seen herself. The bus arrived a few moments later, and Maria climbed aboard, finding a seat near the back. She sat still for a moment, her eyes staring out the window as the city passed by. The lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The truth was out there now. And while it might have taken the cameras, the footage, and the press for her story to be believed, Maria knew that it didn't matter. She had spoken her truth. She had walked away. The world might have seen her as a maid, a suspect, a criminal, but Maria Wilson was something more than that. She was a woman who had fought for her dignity, for her voice, and for her place in the world. And now that world was waiting for her to take her next step. Maria's fingers drummed lightly on the seat in front of her as the bus hummed down the streets of Atlanta. The city stretched out before her, a landscape she had known so well yet felt so unfamiliar now. Each passing streetlight seemed to flicker with the echoes of her past, reminding her of where she had come from, but also illuminating where she was going. And where that might be, she didn't know yet. She only knew that it was a path she would carve for herself, without the walls of the Morgan estate closing in on her. The bus rolled to a stop at a crowded corner, and for a brief moment, the door slid open to let in a rush of people. Maria glanced up as a couple of new passengers entered, but it wasn't their faces that caught her attention. Nuri. It was the voice that cut through the noise, the familiar tone that made her heart flutter in a way she didn't expect. Maria, she froze. It wasn't the voice she expected to hear. Not out here, not like this. But there it was again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Maria, is that you?" She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the front of the bus, a little unsure but smiling with a warmth that Maria hadn't expected, was Lisa, the cook from the Morgan house. Maria's mind raced, trying to process the sight of her, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since she had last seen her in the cold, sterile hallways of that house. Lisa's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time in a long time, Maria saw something there she had never noticed before. Concern. Real, unguarded concern. I was just about to text you," Lisa said, as she slowly made her way to Maria's seat, her voice carrying a note of hesitation but also a quiet determination. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Maria blinked, stunned by the simplicity of the gesture, the unexpected kindness in the middle of everything she had been through. She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. There was so much she wanted to say, but words seemed impossible to find. Everything felt like it had already been said, but Lisa wasn't looking for an explanation. She was just standing there, watching Maria, her gaze soft, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to check in," Lisa continued, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "After everything that happened, I didn't think it was right. You didn't deserve any of it. None of it." Maria swallowed hard, her throat tight. She was grateful, truly grateful, but the weight of the world still sat heavy in her chest. She had never expected Lisa to say anything like this. Lisa, who had always stayed silent, who had kept her distance from the drama in the house. But now here she was, standing in front of Maria, offering her truth. "I know," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm okay now. I don't know what happens next." Lisa nodded, her eyes searching Maria's face, as if trying to figure out what this moment meant. "I think that's okay. I think it's okay not to know," she said softly, and there was something in her words that settled deep inside Maria. It wasn't an answer to the questions that had been crowding her mind for days. It wasn't some grand revelation that made everything clear, but it was enough. They stood there for a moment, in a quiet understanding. The noise of the bus and the world around them fading into the background. Lisa shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of whether to say more or just walk away now. But Maria could see the quiet struggle in her eyes. "I never said anything before," Lisa said finally, her voice laced with guilt. I should have stood up for you, but I didn't, and now I'm sorry for that, Maria." Maria felt the lump in her throat grow again. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved, but what she did know was that she had never expected Lisa to say any of this, to offer her apology, to acknowledge that for years Maria had been seen only for her role in the house, never for her humanity. And that was a truth Maria wasn't sure she could forgive, but she wasn't sure she could hold on to the bitterness either. "I didn't want your apology, Lisa," Maria said slowly, choosing her words carefully, her voice steady. "I needed you to see me for who I am, not for what you think I should be. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not even sure if I can forgive you." Lisa's face crumbled slightly, her mouth trembling as she tried to hold back the emotion in her voice. "I didn't know what to do, Maria. I saw what was happening, but I was afraid to speak up. Afraid of what would happen if I did, but it was wrong, and I should have done something. I should have said something." Maria took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the rawness of it all. "You're not the only one who's been afraid, Lisa," she said, her voice a little softer now. "We're all afraid of something, of standing up, of speaking out. But I've learned that silence doesn't protect anyone. It never does." Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Maria's face. "You're right. I've learned that too, I guess. But what you did, leaving, standing up for yourself, telling the truth, it's brave. You were brave, Maria." Maria took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything she had been holding inside. "It's not bravery, it's survival. I had to survive this, Lisa. I had to live for myself, not for them." The bus stopped again, and a few more passengers climbed aboard. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Maria felt the pull of the world outside, the world she was beginning to re-enter. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she was done looking back. She had moved past the lies, past the people who had tried to tear her down, and now she was walking towards something new. Something for her. Lisa smiled, but it wasn't the same smile Maria had seen years ago in the kitchen, when everything was just as it should have been. It was a quiet, honest smile, one that held no pretense, no apology, just understanding. "If you ever need someone to talk to," Lisa said softly, "yo, I'm here. I may have been too scared to speak up before, but I'm not afraid now." Maria nodded, the weight in her chest finally starting to lift. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she didn't need to know. She just needed to keep walking. Maria's fingers drummed lightly on the seat in front of her as the bus hummed down the streets of Atlanta. The city stretched out before her, a landscape she had known so well, yet felt so unfamiliar now. Each passing streetlight seemed to flicker with the echoes of her past, reminding her of where she had come from, but also illuminating where she was going. And where that might be, she didn't know yet. She only knew that it was a path she would carve for herself, without the walls of the Morgan estate closing in on her. The bus rolled to a stop at a crowded corner, and for a brief moment, the door slid open to let in a rush of people. Maria glanced up as a couple of new passengers entered, but it wasn't their faces that caught her attention. It was the voice that cut through the noise, the familiar tone that made her heart flutter in a way she didn't expect. "Maria," she froze. It wasn't the voice she expected to hear. Not out here, not like this. But there it was again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Maria, is that you?" She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the front of the bus, a little unsure, but smiling with a warmth that Maria hadn't expected, was Lisa, the cook from the Morgan house. Maria's mind raced, trying to process the sight of her. But it felt like a lifetime had passed since she had last seen her in the cold, sterile hallways of that house. Lisa's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time in a long time, Maria saw something there she had never noticed before. Concern. Real, unguarded concern. I was just about to text you," Lisa said as she slowly made her way to Maria's seat. "Ill?" Her voice carrying a note of hesitation, but also a quiet determination. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Maria blinked, stunned by the simplicity of the gesture, the unexpected kindness in the middle of everything she had been through. She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. There was so much she wanted to say, but words seemed impossible to find. Everything felt like it had already been said, but Lisa wasn't looking for an explanation. She was just standing there, watching Maria, her gaze soft, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to check in," Lisa continued, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "After everything that happened, I didn't think it was right. You didn't deserve any of it. None of it." Maria swallowed hard, her throat tight. She was grateful, truly grateful, but the weight of the world still sat heavy in her chest. She had never expected Lisa to say anything like this. Lisa, who had always stayed silent, who had kept her distance from the drama in the house. But now here she was, standing in front of Maria, offering her truth. "I know," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm okay now. I don't know what happens next." Lisa nodded, her eyes searching Maria's face, as if trying to figure out what this moment meant. "I think that's okay. I think it's okay not to know," she said softly. "Why no?" And there was something in her words that settled deep inside Maria. It wasn't an answer to the questions that had been crowding her mind for days. It wasn't some grand revelation that made everything clear, but it was enough. They stood there for a moment, in a quiet understanding. You know, the noise of the bus and the world around them fading into the background. Or Lisa shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of whether to say more or just walk away. But Maria could see the quiet struggle in her eyes. "I never said anything before," Lisa said finally, her voice laced with guilt. "I should have. I should have stood up for you, but I didn't, and now I'm sorry for that, Maria." Maria felt the lump in her throat grow again. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved, but what she did know was that she had never expected Lisa to say any of this, to offer her apology, to acknowledge that for years Maria had been seen only for her role in the house, never for her humanity. And that was a truth Maria wasn't sure she could forgive, but she wasn't sure she could hold onto the bitterness either. "I didn't want your apology, Lisa," Maria said slowly, choosing her words carefully, her voice steady. "I needed you to see me for who I am, not for what you think I should be. And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not even sure if I can forgive you." Lisa's face crumbled slightly, her mouth trembling as she tried to hold back the emotion in her voice. "I didn't know what to do, Maria. I saw what was happening, but I was afraid to speak up. Afraid of what would happen if I did, but it was wrong, and I should have done something. I should have said something." Maria took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the rawness of it all. "You're not the only one who's been afraid, Lisa," she said, her voice a little softer now. "We're all afraid of something, of standing up, of speaking out. But I've learned that silence doesn't protect anyone. It never does." Lisa nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving Maria's face. "You're right, I've learned that too, I guess. But what you did, leaving, standing up for yourself, telling the truth, it's brave. You were brave, Maria." Maria took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything she had been holding inside. "It's not bravery, it's survival. I had to survive this, Lisa. I had to live for myself, not for them." The bus stopped again, and a few more passengers climbed aboard. The soft hum of the engine filled the silence between them. Maria felt the pull of the world outside, the world she was beginning to re-enter. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she was done looking back. She had moved past the lies, past the people who had tried to tear her down, and now she was walking towards something new, something for her. Lisa smiled, but it wasn't the same smile Maria had seen years ago in the kitchen, when everything was just as it should have been. It was a quiet, honest smile, one that held no pretense, no apology, just understanding. "If you ever need someone to talk to," Lisa said softly, "here. I may have been too scared to speak up before, but I'm not afraid now." Maria nodded, the weight in her chest finally starting to lift. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she didn't need to know. She just needed to keep walking. Maria sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a mug of hot tea. The apartment around her was modest, the kind of place that didn't demand attention or make a statement. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall was the only company she had, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing in again. The silence wrapping around her like a shroud. But then she thought about the conversation with Deja. She thought about the podcast, the platform, the opportunity to finally speak, not just for herself, but for every woman who had been forced to shrink, to become invisible, to be silenced. And a small smile tugged at her lips. This was it. The first step into something bigger, something she hadn't even allowed herself to dream of before. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just someone's background noise. Maria set the mug down and stood up, crossing the room to the small window. The lights of the city outside were flickering, alive with energy yet distant. How many stories were unfolding out there? How many people, like her, had a truth they couldn't tell? How many had been swallowed up by a system that didn't see them, didn't care about them, didn't hear them? The world outside had never seemed so vast, so full of possibilities, and yet so heavy with the weight of unspoken lives. And now Maria was a part of that world in a way she had never been before. Her phone buzzed again, the soft vibration pulling her back to reality. She picked it up, already knowing who it was. Malik's name appeared on the screen, a message blinking at her. "Sis, I'm proud of you. You don't know how many people you're helping with this." Maria's heart gave a small leap. She had never needed the world to see her, but the thought of Malik being proud of her was enough to steady the ground beneath her feet. "I'm good, Mal. Just figuring things out." She didn't need to explain everything to him. He had always understood her without words, but the message felt like a lifeline. It reminded her that, no matter what the world thought of her, no matter how the Morgans or anyone else viewed her, Malik would always see her for who she was. "I'll be okay. I'm just taking it one day at a time." She put the phone down and sat back at the table, her mind still spinning, the weight of the decisions she had made settling on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she did know one thing: she wasn't afraid anymore. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maria found herself pacing in her apartment. The day had been long, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her with each step. She had done it. She had taken control of her story, of her life. She had walked away from the Morgans, from their accusations, from their judgment. But what now? What was next? Her mind wandered back to the events of the past few days. The hidden camera footage, the truth it revealed, the apology from Sally Morgan, it all felt like a distant memory now, like it had happened to someone else. The truth had come out, yes, but Maria knew it wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about what came after. The world wasn't going to just hand her justice. She was going to have to fight for it, to keep speaking, to keep pushing until the world couldn't ignore her anymore. And then there was the podcast, the chance to speak, to have her story heard by people who had never known what it was like to be invisible, to be erased by a system that didn't care. She could feel the power in that. The weight of it. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a notification from Voices of Justice. They had sent over the details for the interview, the questions they wanted her to answer. Maria clicked open the message, her heart racing. The questions were simple, but they carried so much weight. She read through them one by one, the words sinking in, making her feel a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. They were asking about her story, about the accusations, about what it meant to be a woman in her position. And then at the end of the list of questions, there was one that stood out. What do you want the world to learn from your story? Maria sat still for a moment, the words hanging in the air. What did she want the world to learn? She thought about it, her mind tracing back through the years she had spent working for the Morgans. The years of quiet suffering, of erasure, of feeling like she was always in the background. She thought about the shame that had been placed on her, the way they had tried to break her. But she hadn't broken. Maria smiled to herself. She didn't want the world to see her as a victim, as someone who had been wronged and had nothing left. She wanted them to see her as someone who had fought, who had stood up, who had refused to be erased. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a maid. She wasn't a background player in someone else's story. She was Maria Wilson, and that was enough. She typed out her response slowly, carefully, making sure the words carried the weight she wanted them to. I want the world to learn that our voices matter. That just because we're not seen, just because we're not heard, doesn't mean we don't exist. We all have a story, and we all deserve to have it told. Maria hit send, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had just taken another step toward owning her truth, toward using her voice. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. She was the one telling the story now. As the night settled around her, Maria felt something inside her shift. It was a quiet, unspoken change, but it was real. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone to make room for her at the table. She was building her own table. Maria spent the next few days in a kind of quiet anticipation, her mind focused on the podcast interview, but her thoughts always returning to one thing, her place in the world. It was strange to think that she had once been so small in the eyes of the Morgans, so invisible, a background character in their grand narrative. Now, for the first time, she felt like she was the one holding the pen. She wasn't waiting for someone else to write her story. She was living it. The air outside had turned cooler with the shift toward fall. The city, always busy, always moving, felt a little slower now. Maria had spent so many years rushing through the days, cleaning the Morgans' house, answering to their demands, putting their needs ahead of her own. But now there was a stillness inside her. It wasn't peace exactly. It was a quiet kind of strength, a confidence she had never known before. She had returned to her old life in East Point, to her small apartment that, for so long, had been a place of rest between her shifts. But now it felt different. It felt like hers in a way it never had before. There were no more whispers of the Morgans' judgment, no more fear of being found out, of being caught in the web of their lives. Now this apartment, this space, was her sanctuary. She found herself sitting in front of her small, worn desk, scribbling in her notebook, her thoughts flowing freely onto the page. She had been writing a lot lately, capturing moments, memories, and feelings that had been tucked away for years. She'd written about the house she had cleaned for so long, about the people who had made her feel invisible. She wrote about her brother Malik and how he had always been the one who saw her, who never doubted her. And she wrote about the journey she was on, the path that had led her here to this moment. And yet, even as she wrote, the past still lingered in the corners of her mind. It was impossible to escape it completely, the way it had shaped her, the way it had tried to break her. But Maria wasn't the same woman she had been when she first walked through the doors of the Morgan estate. She was different now, stronger, more aware of her worth. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, and a small smile tugged at her lips. It was Daisha Harris, the producer from Voices of Justice. They had set up a time for the podcast interview, and Daisha's message read perennial. "We're all set for tomorrow, Maria. Are you ready?" Maria took a deep breath. She hadn't felt nervous about the interview until now. But that was the thing, wasn't it? Even in the midst of everything she had been through, there was still a part of her that wanted to be heard, wanted to be seen. She wasn't afraid anymore. But the thought of sharing her truth with the world, with strangers, with people who would listen to her and not dismiss her, that was a new kind of vulnerability. She typed back quickly, "Berard out ready, as I'll ever be." The next morning, Maria woke early, the excitement building inside her like a pressure that couldn't be ignored. She had dressed simply, but there was something intentional about it. A black blouse, tailored pants, nothing too flashy. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to fit into someone else's version of who she should be. She just wanted to be herself, to speak her truth without hesitation. She took a deep breath before leaving her apartment, stepping into the crisp morning air, her heart beating just a little faster with each step. The podcast studio was just a few blocks away, and as she walked, the noise of the city surrounded her. It felt like the world was waking up with her, every honk of a horn, every footstep on the pavement, a reminder that she was part of something bigger now. Her voice had power. When she arrived at the studio, the door opened before she even had a chance to knock. Deja Harris greeted her with a warm smile, her handshake firm but welcoming. There was something calming about Deja, something grounded. She led Maria into a cozy recording room, the walls lined with microphones and sound equipment. There was a comfortable chair for Maria to sit in, and Deja motioned for her to settle in. "Take your time," Deja said, gesturing to a glass of water on the table. "I'm glad you're here, Maria. This is your time to speak. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing, we're listening." Maria nodded, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel the weight of the moment, the magnitude of what she was about to do. She wasn't just telling her story. She was telling the stories of all the women who had come before her, who had been silenced, who had been overlooked. She was telling their stories too. The interview began, and at first Maria's voice was soft, uncertain. She stumbled over a few words, and there was a brief, uncomfortable silence. But with each question, with each pause, she began to find her rhythm. She began to speak of the Morgans, of the years spent cleaning their house, of the accusations, of the hidden camera footage, of the shame that had been placed on her. And as she spoke, she began to realize something. She wasn't just telling a story, she was reclaiming it. With each word, Maria felt herself standing taller. She felt the weight of the world lifting piece by piece as she spoke her truth into the microphone. She wasn't just reclaiming her life, she was giving voice to those who had never been heard. She was a part of something bigger now, a movement, a change, a collective voice of women who refused to be erased. As the interview ended, Deja thanked her for sharing her story. "You did amazing, Maria. The world needs to hear this. You need to be heard." Maria smiled, a feeling of warmth and accomplishment filling her chest. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She had spoken, and now the world was listening. Later that night, as she sat in her apartment, the familiar sound of Malik's text coming through her phone, Maria felt a deep, quiet peace settle over her. "Sis, you were incredible. The world is going to hear you." And Maria, looking out the window at the city that had always been just beyond her reach, knew that the world had already started to listen. The days that followed felt like a quiet revolution. Maria's story, her voice, had traveled far beyond the walls of her apartment. The podcast interview had aired, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from all over, from women who had experienced the same invisible weight, from men who had never seen the world through her eyes, from people who had been waiting for someone to speak up for them, for all the voices that had been buried under years of silence. Maria spent her time reading through the messages, her heart swelling with a kind of bittersweet pride. She wasn't just Maria Wilson anymore. She was someone who had sparked a conversation, someone whose truth had reverberated through the world in a way she could never have imagined. The things people said to her were humbling, but more than that, they were a reminder of how much people needed to be heard, how much they needed someone to stand up and say, "This is wrong," even when it was easier to remain silent. One evening, as she sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her notebook, the door to her apartment creaked open. Malik stepped inside, his usual grin plastered on his face, But there was something different about him tonight. Something that made his smile feel fuller, more genuine. "You did it, sis," Malik said, his voice full of pride. "I can't believe how much you've changed, how much you've helped." Maria smiled back at him, a quiet, almost tired smile. "I'm not done yet. This is just the beginning." Malik's eyes softened as he took a seat beside her at the desk. "You've been fighting for so long. You've made them see you, Maria, and now the world is starting to see you too." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "I've fought for a long time. But I'm not fighting for the Morgans anymore. I'm fighting for everyone else, for everyone who's been silenced." Malik reached over and took her hand, giving it a squeeze. "You're not just fighting for them, sis. You're fighting for yourself. And that's the strongest thing anyone can do." For a moment, Maria didn't speak. The room was still, the silence between them filled with something deep, something that she couldn't quite put into words. She hadn't realized, not until now, that she had been fighting for herself all along. She hadn't been fighting for the validation of others, for their approval, for their recognition. She had been fighting to find her voice, to reclaim her space in a world that had always tried to push her down, to make her small. She looked up at Malik, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that had been missing for so long. "I'm not invisible anymore," she said, her voice steady and clear. Malik smiled at her, a wide grin that reached all the way to his eyes. "Never were, sis. You were just waiting for the world to catch up." The next day, Maria woke early, the morning sun casting a golden glow across her small apartment. She stood at the window for a moment, letting the light wash over her, feeling it in her bones. She had been waiting for so long, waiting for someone else to see her, to hear her. But now she knew the truth. She didn't need anyone else's validation. Maria was the author of her own story now. She had faced the lies, the accusations, the silencing of her truth. She had walked away from the life she had known, from the house that had tried to define her, from the people who had erased her. And in doing so, she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for herself. The world was hers now, but not in the way the Morgans had owned it. It was hers because she had fought for it. She had earned it. She had made room for herself in a world that had never made room for people like her. As Maria stood in the soft morning light, she felt the weight of everything she had been through, everything she had survived, lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She picked up her notebook from the desk and opened it to a blank page. With steady hands, she began to write. "They tried to make me invisible. But I refused to shrink. I refused to let them define me, and now the world is listening. Not because I asked them to, but because I've made myself heard." She set the pen down, a deep, quiet satisfaction filling her chest. The words weren't just hers. They were for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been erased. Maria closed the notebook and smiled. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.